It's my great privilege to introduce you all to Professor William Scott Jackson, who is our speaker today. Professor Scott Jackson is Chairman of Oxford Strategic Consulting and Visiting Professor at Cass Business School. He's also an Associate Fellow of the Oxford Centre for Mutual and Employee-Owned Business at Oxford University, a member of the Vice-Chancellor's Circle, and of Pembroke, St Cross and Kellogg colleges. He and his team carry out advanced research and consultancy work focusing on the development of human capital, research and human capital, entrepreneurial capabilities, human resource effectiveness, and the development of national leadership. Sadly, not public speaking, because I could apparently use some help with that today. Alongside this research and consultancy role, William is an entrepreneur, having sold 3 consultancy companies since 2000. Named by CIPD as one of the top 5 HR thinkers, William is regularly invited to consult and present on behavioural and social issues, strategic human resources and leadership. So we're extremely lucky to have him here today with us. And without further ado, I would like to hand over to you, William.
Morning, everybody. Well, the big advantage of a Zoom call is you can't actually throw anything. So if you're really annoyed about anything, save it to the end and send me an email. So I'm going to share my screen so that I can run a presentation through. And as you heard, we're going to do it in 2 parts because I run out of steam after about 10 minutes. And then we'll have questions and then we'll do another part after that. So without further ado, let's share the screen. There we go. Okay, so today we're going to explore how to maximize happiness, but in particular, I'm going to focus on the type of active happiness, which could loosely be described as enthusiasm or engagement. And these findings come from research over many years, which is summarized in this book published by Springer. So what are we aiming to achieve? The aim of today's session is to give you some tips and ideas on how to maximize your own happiness and the happiness of those around you. But there are some limitations and some cautions from our research. So number 1 is it's of course perfectly normal for specific situations to cause you to feel stressed or anxious or unhappy. This is a normal evolutionary response to help us deal with danger and to learn from it. Today's session won't deal with clinical depression or any clinical condition. So if you feel you've got clinical depression or anxiety or any other issue, then please consult your health professional. And lastly, it's perfectly possible to be too optimistic or too positive. In some roles, for example, sales, selection tends to favour somewhat over-optimistic people, but there is a danger that they fail to learn from things that go wrong. They've got very little awareness of their own faults or impact, and you can lack empathy for less over-optimistic people. So we don't want to go too mad. Okay, so one of the interesting conclusions from our research is that there's a distinct difference between active and passive types of happiness. And it's quite important to distinguish actions or programs that might impact one or the other, because they turn out to be quite different. So a person with low levels of passive happiness could be described as sad or anxious, and their own unhappiness will have a fairly strong impact on those around you, as you'll all know. A person with high levels of passive happiness could be seen as coping, satisfied, contented, and not stressed. This category, funnily enough, tends to have much less impact on other people. Now, you could have a person with low levels of active happiness. They could be angry or upset, and they'll have a very strong negative impact on people around them. And a person with high levels of active happiness would be enthused, and enthusiasm, of course, can be extremely infectious with a powerful impact on those around you. If we also introduce an axis for time, so we've gone 3D now, very short-term versions of these categories are described as mood, or technically affect. But ideally, of course, we'd be both satisfied and enthused over time. So we need to think about both of these types of happiness. But ironically, most international programs and global measures of happiness, so you'll quite often find things like, Bhutan is the happiest country on the world, or, Dubai's just gone up to number 12 in the happiness ratings. The global measures of happiness, they tend to focus on the passive forms of happiness. However, we've worked with several countries and organizations on maximising happiness. And if you look at this guy, he's obviously contented, he's obviously perfectly happy, but he's not a lot of use to anybody. So countries and companies, and indeed people really, and in our own work with the government of Dubai, for example, the objective is active happiness. Contentment on its own is not necessarily functional. So an achievement comes from active enthusiasm, not just passive contentment. So I'm kind of arguing against just focusing on things where there's the most help. And there's many books and programs and apps to help with this passive form of happiness, including many based on mindfulness and meditation, but there's much less help on active happiness. In fact, there's such a gap that I'm considering developing an app to help. Not that I'm an app developer. So if anybody can help me with an app, do let me know. I'll be very pleased to hear from you. So what about the active dimension? How can we increase active enthusiasm and decrease anger and upset? And here I'd like to introduce Blob and Rocket. You all know someone like Rocket, who's always enthusiastic, always sees the positive, and is always optimistic. But we also know someone like poor old Blob, who's usually pretty flat. He usually sees the negative and most often pessimistic, very often about themselves. And in any group of like 10 people, you know, there will be people along these various scales. It turns out that this way of seeing the world is a style which the person uses to interpret things that have and will happen, particularly where they don't know why they've happened. And I'll explore that a bit in a minute. It's called their attribution style, and this has been researched and applied in fields such as depression and positive psychology for many years. And later on we'll explore this, and I'll give you some easy practical tips on how to modify your own attribution style if you want to. But first, it's quite interesting to see the incredible impact that happiness, and in particular the active forms of happiness, can have on individuals and society. As we can see, happiness and engagement have significant impacts on factors such as health, productivity, social issues such as divorce, as well, of course, as being extremely desirable in their own right. But worldwide, very few people are happy or engaged on any kind of measure, which is a bit sad. It's also not quite true, because as I said before, the measures tend to focus on one particular type of happiness or engagement. But why is this? The main causes of high or low happiness and engagement are not the material factors that are typically focused on, like living conditions, pay, and so on. So these matter up to a certain level. But once you get into a developed country where these kind of factors go above a certain level, then they become less and less important in terms of your own personal happiness. So for example, you know, if somebody's fairly well off and you give them some more money, it might make them happy for 10 minutes, but it's not going to be a big contributor to their overall happiness. In fact, the most important factors are other people, and in businesses this tends to be the leader, and most importantly and most interestingly, myself. And it turns out we've got, as it were, a propensity for active happiness. And luckily it's not a personality factor, it's a trained kind of response, so we can do something about it. So we'll talk about other people in this section, and then you can ask your questions after that. And then after the questions, we'll cover the most important section, which is how we can maximize our own personal happiness and propensity for enthusiasm. So first, let's talk about other people. And for the moment, because I do a lot of work in companies, I'm going to use the example of a leader. Now, we've all had a leader, even if we haven't got one now. And if you haven't got one now, you're very lucky, because it turns out most leaders aren't very good. And we're going to cover other kinds of people in a moment. Now, leadership training, text and advice tends to focus on the leader as some kind of hero, visionary, inspiring, charismatic, adaptive, authentic and transformational. In fact, a total fantasy that doesn't exist. They also tend to focus on the top person, the leader of a company, when our research finds that my happiness and my engagement is almost totally to do with the nightmare who is my immediate boss. It's not generally to do with the chairman of the company or Steve Jobs or somebody else that gets written about. So let's get practical. Let's suppose you've got the perfect job. You're really making a difference, it's exciting and rewarding, so you'll be enthusiastic, engaged and happy, right? Well, not necessarily, because unfortunately, there's him. There's your immediate boss. Now, we did a survey of 2 well-respected companies employing more than 20,000 people, and these were the typical comments about first-line leaders. None of them are very encouraging. So it's telling people off in public, incompetent, boring, selfish. So this is quite interesting because generally speaking, people are not unpleasant. You know, there's a probability that a probability curve which shows that most people are not particularly unpleasant. So let's assume that this person...
People are not actually evil on purpose.
Ah,
why are they like this?
I got a feedback.
It's because they don't know any better.
You know, that was 2 technical problems. Do allow me, excuse me there, I'm just going to do that. That's obviously got a... There we are, you see. Get rid of that. Thank you. Right, that definitely was all the technical problems. Thank you so much. So let's assume that he isn't actually evil on purpose. So why are they like this? It turns out they don't actually know any better. So again, the research found that most people get promoted to leader role because they're good at something else, like IT or medicine, rather than leadership. But they're the ones with the most impact. And most of the training actually goes to more senior leaders, not these first line people. So they aren't taught the basics of leadership. Now, one of our projects found that the first line leaders start off enthusiastic and all is great, but at some point they have to have a difficult conversation or discipline somebody or tell somebody off, and they don't know how to do it. They just don't know what to do. So it goes wrong. Their own enthusiasm drops, which affects everyone else. Things start to slip, and they don't know what to do about that either. Many drop out of this stage, but some lucky or exceptional people start to learn by experience, start to pull things around, and hopefully begin enthusing their teams. And it turns out that the most damaging leader actions are nothing to do with rare personal characteristics like vision, charisma, or transformation, but are a set of basic skills, almost technical skills of leadership. How do you actually tell somebody off? How do you actually organize a meeting that makes sense? So the good news is that even he can get the basic leadership skills right, and it's pretty simple. It's so simple, this time I actually produced the design for an app. So if anybody wants to help me, let me know, which I'll just use here to illustrate the point. So this app allows the team to record how they feel, suggests actions to the leader, as well as anything he or she knows they need to do, like organize a meeting. And if we look in a bit more detail at a frank conversation, so the app helps you to prepare, which people should do, but they tend not to. So what tends to happen is the leader's annoyed about something, storms into the middle of the office and tells somebody off. That isn't preparation. So it just helps the leaders prepare properly, to organize the session, to make sure it's in a private room, you know, to make sure there's a time allocated to it, to make sure it's not a rush, to make sure the person knows what they're talking about. To follow best practice, to run the session itself effectively. So why are we here? What are we doing? You know, how are we going to talk about this? Agree the actions and agree an action the follow-up. So it's pretty simple, but in our research, as I say, 99% of leaders, especially first-line leaders, don't follow anything like this process. So we need to prepare our leaders and ourselves to do some very straightforward things well. And our research found the most tricky things were frank conversation, running an effective meeting, planning and managing tasks, managing conflict, delegation, and making decisions. And finally, of course, engaging the team, which, as we've seen, partly depends on how the immediate leader does these tasks and partly on how the leader themselves feels, as it's not easy to enthuse others if you're miserable or anxious yourself. Now, I've used leaders, but of course, these kind of issues actually apply to any kind of person in any kind of relationship, as we all have to have difficult conversations, make good decisions, organize who does what, and enthuse another person. All of us are in a relationship with somebody or other, hopefully, and none of us have been trained, except by watching others, on how to do it. So what can you do about it? So we think about other people who can make you miserable or enthuse you. We can either assume they're horrible on purpose, which is actually the main assumption that we tend to make. They're doing this deliberately. Or we can assume that they don't know what they're doing. They're just not particularly very good at dealing with people in certain stressful situations. And this could be your spouse. You know, your spouse is not evil, let's assume. They might not know what they're doing. They might not know how to talk to you in a certain situation, and vice versa. And of course, hardly anybody is trained to be a great husband, wife, parent, or friend. So it's worth thinking about what sort of things they're doing that upset or enthuse you. What are their intentions? You know, what are they trying to achieve when they tell you something? And what might work better for them and for you? And you might even be able to talk to them about your thoughts. But even thinking about it will allow you to improve things. Because of course, it turns out that we have an effect on them as well. So what can we and they do to help maximize each other's active happiness? Firstly, we should focus on strengths, not weaknesses. What's great about them and what is there to really like? You know, even if they're a relative, you probably liked them at one point in time, even if you didn't choose them. And even in marriage, people have their own interests, but they also do things together. To offer to help is extremely enthusing, but only if it's sincere and acted upon. We often take our anxieties out on those nearest to us, which is exactly the opposite of what is needed to help our and their happiness. Exactly the opposite. And in thinking about what's good about a person, don't keep it to yourself. Verbalize it. Use compliments, agreement, and appreciation. Thank you goes quite a long way. And similarly, it's easy to get in the habit of not paying much attention to someone that we see a lot. Again, exactly the opposite of what's needed. You should pay more attention to the person that you see regularly than people that you don't. And obviously, if you know you do something that's annoying them, it's quite a good idea to avoid it. But on the other hand, don't get worked up over something they do that's actually quite trivial. And finally, try to stay calm about and think about what's happening rather than fly into a bad mood. And never forget that your happiness depends on theirs and vice versa. So it's well worth trying to make the effort to make them happy. So now we're going to talk about the other major causal factor, which is actually the most important, which is my own attribution style and my propensity for enthusiasm. So what can I do to maximize my own happiness and this propensity, this, how enthusiastic I'm liable to be? And here I want to introduce Blob and Rocket, and to show that even Blob can increase his own propensity and active happiness. And it turns out this largely depends on the way in which this person interprets positive and negative things that have and will happen, which is why it's a learnt behaviour, because we respond to positive and negative things that have happened all through our lives. This is called attribution style. And as I said, it's been researched and applied in depression, positive psychology, etc. for many years. And it forms the basis, for example, for cognitive behavioural therapy. But it turns out it can also be applied to everyday situations and to our own personal happiness. So let's suppose they both fail an interview. As in many situations, and this is quite interesting when you ask people, because they think they do know the actual causes, but it turns out they don't. So in many situations, we don't actually have many facts about why this might have happened. So we use our unconscious attribution style to try and explain it to ourselves. So Rocket will tend to explain it to herself by applying her positive attribution style. She'll explain or attribute the cause as being something that won't impact future events, won't impact other types of situations, and isn't a fundamental issue with her. So it could be the interviewer was used to her, so I had a cold, or I didn't really want the job, or I should have prepared better. They're kind of one-off things, and they're not fundamentally to do with her. That's called a positive attribution style. Blob, on the other hand, will tend to explain it as something that affects future interviews and even in other situations, and is something wrong with him. It'll be, I'm not good with people, I'm unlucky, or even I'm stupid. This is called a negative attribution style. Now, the good news is, this style is mostly not genetic or a fundamental part of our personality. It's a learnt behaviour from childhood, and it can be relearned. So what's the point of an attribution style if it's kind of useless, especially for Mr. Blob? So the reason is that we have to understand things that happen so that we can learn for future events. So we know how to act in the future, especially negative events. So negative things that happen are the strongest influences on how we behave in the future. Most of the time, we don't actually know why things went wrong. So we develop this general theory of cause, which we often deploy even when there's evidence to the contrary. And this is a real example of this interview, because this Blob person, he'd had a letter saying that he'd done really well, but the vacancy had been cancelled, but he still felt it was because he's stupid, despite the evidence to the contrary. So if your attribution style is really strong, you will even overturn like facts and deploy your attribution style instead, which is very bad. So this theory can be wrong in many situations and can drive unhelpful feelings and behaviours. It turns out, which is quite interesting, it's much more functional to have a slightly unrealistically positive attribution style. So if Rocket, for example, is actually wrong, she did useless in the interview, it's better for her if she perhaps thinks that wasn't the cause. If she thinks it was because, maybe she didn't want the job or whatever. And the reason for that is because sadly, this learning is self-reinforcing. Because if Blob goes for an interview thinking he's stupid or terrible at interviews, then he's likely to do badly. So his attribution style is reinforced for next time. If Rocket goes along thinking she's fine and last time was just a blip, then she'll likely do better and her positive style is reinforced, actually inaccurately. But it doesn't matter because it's still reinforced and she'll still do better at the next interview. And this is how the style develops from childhood. So the good news is that anyone can develop a more positive attribution style and a greater propensity for enthusiasm and engagement, but how? In clinical settings, we would probably use cognitive behavioural therapy, which can be a long process. But for ourselves, we can use a much simpler and quicker reframing technique. So the technique of reframing, which can be taught through courses online, or actually just from looking at this slide, it's not necessarily difficult, involves, first of all, catching it. So the person learns to recognise when they've interpreted events or predicted how future events will turn out through their style rather than on the evidence. So Blob, for example, might think to himself, well, actually, do I know that I was stupid? You know, do I know that the interviewer thought I was awful? Or am I just kind of guessing? Is there any other thing that it might be to do with? So this applies particularly to negative events, as we learn very strongly from these kind of situations. So if we fail an interview, have we simply assumed the reason? The second thing is to check it, which is think about the actual evidence. What do you actually know about what happened or will happen? Or what could you find out about what happened or will happen? So could you just ask the company, you know, what was the actual reason? And they might say, well, we have somebody with you know, a PhD in whatever the thingy is. And then the last step, really, which is extremely powerful, is to change it. And this is quite interesting because all you do is you robustly think of at least 3 alternative explanations for what just happened or what might happen. So if you fail an interview, even if you're convinced that it was because you're stupid or not good enough, you have to think of 3 alternative explanations. And it's a practice. And almost immediately, this simple process will begin to modify attribution style, increase optimism and enthusiasm, and maximise your propensity for engagement. So it's not rocket science, to coin a phrase. It's fairly simple. And the powerfulest bit of it is to force yourself to think of 3 alternative explanations. So, you know, if I've just had a massive argument with my wife, I must stop using my wife. But anyway, if you've had a massive argument with my wife, and my first thing is, you know, because she's nasty, I have to think of 3 alternative explanations. And that calm thinking, that slight, you know, application of logic will help you to change your underlying style, which is a very powerful thing. So there are also some things that
help improve your active.
Oh, there we go. So that's me on my speaker again. You can tell I practiced this presentation once, can't you? I'll just get rid of that. There we go. Right. Yeah, so there's some handy actions that have been widely recommended around the place. They're not from my research in particular, but they're a general set of things that are quite useful, which can help improve your active and passive happiness, both of them, and the happiness of those around you. So for example, pre-coronavirus, I was in a cafe with a colleague and we had a particularly irritated waiter. And I'm sure a lot of you have had a particularly irritated waiter at one time or another. And my colleague's response was to be justifiably annoyed and argue back. And this ended up with all 3 of us in a worse mood and no better or worse cup of coffee as a result. In fact, it might have been a worse cup of coffee for all I know. The next week, funnily enough, we had the same waiter pretty much in the same mood. And this time we tried just saying thank you in a calm way. And he then apologised and explained that his mother had been taken into hospital, but he was having trouble seeing her because the cafe owner wouldn't give any time off, etc. He was so pleased that someone had taken the time to at least be polite. So all of us felt a bit more happy, although I can't claim the coffee was any different. But just simply saying thank you in a kind of surprising situation, you know, when the expected response would have been to be annoyed, can be quite a powerful thing, and it will make you feel better, as importantly as making the other person feel better. So all of these things are, you know, generally things that have been shown to contribute to happiness, both types of happiness. So to summarize, we've discussed how to help mitigate any negative effects that other people might have on you, and how making other people happy will also help you. But most importantly, we've looked at techniques to help you maximize your own attribution style and enthusiasm for life, as well as these various tips on how to improve both passive and active happiness. So thanks very much indeed. And if anyone wants a copy of the slides or to contact me, the email address is on screen. Thank you so much.